have heard of a land on a faraway strand. In the Bible the story is told, where cares never come, never darkness nor gloom, and nothing shall ever grow.
Exodus chapter 3, Moses encounters God in the form of a burning bush. What made that burning bush unique was not that it was a bush or that it was burning, but that it wasn't consumed by the fire. That's what caught Moses' attention when he walked over there. He is called out to by God, then told he needs to take his shoes off because the ground where he stands is holy ground. He explains that he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and says that he's aware of the suffering of the Israelites, and that he's chosen Moses to go and lead them out of Egypt. Moses asks, well, who can I say has sent me? And that's where the famous I am who I am answer comes back. And then he assures Moses that he's going to be with him and going to provide him with signs and all that good stuff. Then, and I think I'll just give you the synopsis of it. I'm not sure exactly how many verses back it goes. Towards the end of the chapter, God tells Moses a series of things. That's very important in tonight's lesson. He tells him that the people will listen to him. He tells him that Pharaoh will not listen to him. And that as a result of that he will bring plagues on the Egyptians until eventually they relent and the people of Israel will leave and they will ask on their way out for things and end up plundering Egypt on their way out. Now, it's very important that we realize that God has actually laid all that out for him, told him ahead of time, this is what's going to happen. Because the first half of chapter 4 becomes a really interesting discussion when you know that God has already said to him, the people are going to listen to you. So Moses answered is how chapter 4 begins. And this is one of those places where it's a convenient chapter break, but it's not a subject matter chapter break. This isn't a true paragraph break, if you will. Moses answered and said, what if they will not believe me or listen to what I say? Wait a minute. God just told him that they would. So why is he asking that question? Okay. And when we get down in a few verses, there's going to be something else said that's going to definitively, I think, answer the question of why. God's going to kind of set his concern at ease. But I want us to be thinking about that while we're reading because, most of us, if we read an express statement in the scriptures at some point, we generally conclude that we can put our faith in it and know that we should go forward in faith, right? Well, except for those really difficult ones like, and lo, I'm with you always to the end of the age, and then we're not always convinced that God is actually there with us, taking care of us, even though he said he always would be. And when God says to us that he is faithful, we don't always trust that he's taking care of us, even though he said that he would, and that he's faithful. So we're not really any different than Moses in that respect. But anyway, that's what he says. Well, what if they don't listen to me? And he says, verse 2, what's in your hand? Now I got a lesson that I entitled, What is in Your Hand? It's drawn from this text where I use this as a jumping off point and then say, basically, God can use us with whatever we have. We don't need the things that we don't have, which is what you hear a lot of. Well, if I had this, then I would do that. And if I had this, then I would do that. And if we could only attain this, then we would be successful at that. That's not what God needs us to do. What does God need us to do? Trust Him and work with what we have. What's in your hand? He said, a staff. He said, throw it on the ground. So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses fled from it. The Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand and grasp it by his tail. So he stretched out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand. Now, I'm going to go ahead and say something real quick. This is a parlor trick. I mean, let's just be fair. This is the kind of thing that the Magi in Egypt would replicate. Why would God do this and tell him, hey, here's your sign. This is what I want you to throw that staff down, turns into a snake, pick it back up, turns into a staff again. Why would God do it? I mean, you got to keep in mind, this is the same God who at one point opened up the heavens. The Holy Spirit descended in the form of a dove, and he spoke from heaven in the presence of everyone and said, this is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased. Can God make his presence known? So, what if they don't believe that you sent me? What he could do very easily is speak to them the same way he's speaking to Moses. But that's not what he does, and that's not what he even suggests. This is actually a process of teaching Moses something, and us by extension. Moses is having trouble trusting that it's going to turn out the way that God has said. So this is as much for Moses as it is for anyone else. So let's look at the next one. Verse 5 says, that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. But what does that have to do with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? I mean, that's my point. Again, the magicians of Egypt are going to be able to do things like this. Up to a point, right? So how does that cause anyone to believe that this is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? That's the question we need to ask ourselves. And keep reading. Furthermore, the Lord said to him, put your hand in your bosom. So he put his hand in his bosom, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous like snow. He said, put your hand in your bosom again. So he put his hand in his bosom again, and he took it out of his bosom, and behold, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. Okay, that's another big thing. And that may be a bigger thing than the previous one. But is this the most amazing thing that God's ever done? Not really. And so it shall come about, he says in verse 8, if they will not believe you or heed the witness of the first sign, that they may believe the witness of the last sign. But it shall be that if they will not believe even these two signs, or heed what you say, and by the way, that's kind of important, that little phrase stuck in there, or heed what you say. Really, that's all they should have to have is his testimony. Then you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground. The water which you take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. So here we've got three signs now. Moses said to the Lord, please, Lord, I've never been eloquent, neither recently nor in time past, nor since thou hast spoken to thy servant, for I'm slow of speech and slow of tongue. And I'm going to stop there. Let's talk about this for just a little bit. So his first objection, well, this isn't really his first objection. His first objection really came in chapter 3, but his first objection in chapter 4 is, what if they don't believe? Even though God just said they're going to believe you, what if they don't believe me? Okay, here's a sign. Oh, and if they don't believe that, here's another sign. Oh, and if they don't believe that, here's another sign. Now, this is the same God who would later say, an evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign. But he gives him these three signs, and then Moses says, yeah, I'm just not a good talker. Just not good at this. What is Moses doing? He's making excuses. That's exactly what Moses is doing. Moses hadn't failed to understand what God said. And I'm not even convinced that Moses completely lacks faith in God. He's scared. And we talked about this a little bit last week. Why would he be scared to go into Egypt when God said, I'm going to send you back into Egypt? Okay, he was a wanted man. Keep that in the back of your mind. All this is for a reason. And so he says, well, I'm just not an eloquent guy, neither recently nor in time past. By the way, I don't believe he was slow of speech. He had the greatest education that the world had to offer at the time. He had been educated in the household of the Pharaoh of Egypt. Money couldn't buy a better education than he had. Not to mention, more important than that, what? God was with him. And God chose him. And God chose him to speak for him. And would God choose him to do something that he's incapable of doing? No. But anyway, that's his excuse. I'm just not good at this. By the way, Paul was accused of having contemptible speech as well by some. I don't think he did either. The Lord said to him, who has made man's mouth? Now, what's the point of that question? Wait, are you really going to say to me you're not eloquent? Is that really what you're going to say, that you're slow of tongue? Yeah, that's kind of, it's reminiscent of God speaking in the book of Job. When Job is wrestling with all these questions, and then God speaks up finally and says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? It's the same type of thing. Who made the human mouth? Don't you think that if I want you to speak, you'll be able to speak? And that's what he goes on to say. Who made man's mouth? Or who makes him dumb or deaf? Or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Did I not order the world the way that it is? Do I not have control over the things that I've created? Now then go, and I, even I, will be with your mouth. And will teach you what you are to say. You're not going to have to write your speeches, Moses. I'm going to tell you what to say. You just go. Then the anger of the Lord burned against Moses. And he said, is there not your brother Aaron the Levite? I'm going to stop here for a moment and ask a question. I've never really heard too many people talk about this. At this point, well, I guess I skipped a verse, huh? I skipped one verse. Where he says, please, Lord, send the message by whomever thou wilt. But I want you to notice, and the implication there is he's asking him to send him with someone else. But when you ask by whomever thou will, he's also resigned to say, okay, if it has to be me, then whoever you will. But he's opening the door for God to say, okay, I'll send somebody else. And that's why God gets angry. But the real question is, why does God introduce Aaron to the process at all? Okay. And we're going to push on this a little bit more. But those are both good observations, and we're going to push on this and expand on this as the text goes on, because there's something else going on here that we need to be aware of. So he says, is there not your brother Aaron the Levite, I know he speaks fluently, and moreover, behold, he is coming out to meet you. When he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. Now, I'm going to stop there for a moment, and I'll also say Aaron did not have the advantage of being raised as Pharaoh's grandson and the education of the Egyptians. Aaron was just raised with the slave Hebrews. But he's fluent of speech. And you are to speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I, even I, will be with your mouth and his mouth, and I will teach you what you are to do. Moreover, he shall speak for you to the people, and it shall come about that he shall be as a mouth for you, and you shall be as a God to him. Verse 16 is the really interesting verse to me. And that's where we start actually seeing what Aaron is the type of. He is a Levite, but there were 12 people given Christ out of the world too, who were sent out into the world as ambassadors for him and to speak for him. Who are those people? The apostles. And Moses is a type of Christ. So I would submit that all the way back there, we're already getting this idea set up that the Son is going to have those who will speak for him. The Father is going to give the Son what to say, and the Son is going to put the words in the mouths of those who will speak for him. Read the Gospel of John, and you will see this rehearsed over and over again. That the Father has given you to me. I speak as the Father has given me to speak. I give you his words. Now you take my words. And the last thing he says to him is what? Go speak them to the world. I'm sending you out to speak on my behalf. I think that Aaron sets forth as a type of the apostles and prophets of Christ. You shall take in your hand this staff with which you shall perform the signs. So take your staff with you, your shepherd's staff. Then Moses departed, returned to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, please let me go, that I may return to my brethren who are in Egypt, and see if they are still alive. And Jethro said to Moses, go in peace. Now, verse 18 is interesting. Either Moses just shows a lot of deference to his father-in-law, or Moses is yet looking for someone else to tell him, I'm sorry, you can't leave. So that he can then go back to God and say, well, God, I wanted to go, but my father-in-law won't let me leave. And I'm beholden to him because I work for him and he gives me a place to live. But anyway, the Lord said to Moses in Midian, go back to Egypt. Now listen to this. I told you we would get to it. This whole exercise is leading to this line, for all the men who were seeking your life are dead. Why Moses is stalling, the excuses that he's given directly are connected to that fear. And God says they're all dead. But does anybody find anything else interesting about that verse? All right, so turn to Matthew 2. Matthew chapter 2 and verse 20 is the key text. But we're going to keep in mind, and I'll lay the foundation here, Herod is trying to kill all the little boys, so they flee to Egypt. And out of Egypt I will call my son. We know that prophecy. Well, here in chapter 2, verse 19, when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, arise and take the child and his mother and go into the land of Israel. Take the child and his mother. Go into the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. It is another direct parallel to the story of the Christ. It is yet one more link in Moses being a type of Christ. Same language. Moses departed, okay, and then God says, don't worry about these people that are seeking to kill you, they're dead. So Moses took his wife and his sons. How many sons did Moses have? 2. Gershom and Eliezer. They're named in a few chapters down the road. Don't know their ages at this point. Moses took his wife and his sons and mounted them on a donkey, and he returned to the land of Egypt. Moses also took the staff of God in his hand. And the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders which I have put in your power. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Now, I want to go ahead and tell you this now. As we read through this story, you will see it vacillate between God hardened Pharaoh's heart, Pharaoh hardened Pharaoh's heart. The word, all kinds of things are interchangeable. It's all the same thing. It's the same process. And it takes 2 to tango, as the saying goes. It was God, through the message that was delivered through Moses, that hardened Pharaoh's heart. It was Pharaoh who hardened his heart by refusing the message. So it just kind of depends on which way you're looking at it, but both parties are involved in the process. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my son, my firstborn. Now, this is interesting as well, because firstborn implies what? Well, it does, but it also implies that there is a second. And I think that this is somewhat type antitype. Israel is the first, but there's another Israel, a spiritual Israel, that's coming along later. Israel is my firstborn. So I said to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. But you have refused to let him go. Behold, I will kill your son, your firstborn. Now this is even foreshadowing in the story itself, because that plays out over the next couple of chapters. Now it came about at the lodging place, or at the inn, if you're reading from a King James version of the Bible, or maybe the New King James may say inn as well. On the way that the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Met who? And sought to put who to death? Anybody? Go ahead, be bold and brave and just shout your answer out. It's Moses. Now let's make some sense out of this. God has just chosen Moses and dealt with him during all this time as Moses is trying to avoid what he is being told to do. And he patiently deals with him and patiently deals with him and gives him some signs to make him happy and tells him some other, and then he even goes so far as to say, look, they're going to listen to you. Pharaoh's not going to listen to you. You're going to bring some plagues on it. All this stuff, he's mapped all this out. So why does he show up here on his way to Egypt, angry at him and wanting to kill him? So let's read what it says. We got to read verses 24 through 26 kind of as a block. And we'll have to draw from our knowledge earlier in what's been revealed. It came about at the lodging place on the way that the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. And then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and threw it on Moses' feet. Some translate, I like the ESV translation here a whole lot better. It says he touched his feet. That's actually, I think, the idea that's here. And she said, you are indeed a bridegroom of blood to me. So he let him alone. At that time, she said, "You're a bridegroom of blood because of the circumcision." So what's actually taking place here has to do with the fact that Moses' son has not been circumcised. Now, there's actually two of them, but it only talks about one. I don't know if both of them got circumcised that night or just one of them got circumcised. The story only needs to talk about one because there's a point to the story. Going back to Genesis 17. Let's just keep our finger here and go back to Genesis 17 so we can remind ourselves about circumcision. Because circumcision was something that was instituted long before the law. We have to understand that to begin with. So back in Genesis 17, we'll read verses 10, 11, and 12. "This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you. And every male among you who is 8 days old shall be circumcised throughout your generations. A servant who is born in the house or who is bought with money from any foreigner who is not of your descendants, a servant who is born in your house or who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised." So this extended even beyond the children. Listen to what he says down in verse 14. "But an uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant." Was Moses a descendant of Abraham? Yes. And we can conclude that Moses was circumcised. We can also now conclude that 40 years passed. Okay, so we know Moses' general life. And I say general because we're not given a whole lot of information. So when he's a baby, he was put in the water. He was found by Pharaoh's daughter. And then what did she do with him? Gave him back to his mother to take care of him until he was weaned. At which point he would have been circumcised. Actually, he would have been circumcised before he went in the water because I think he was 3 months old when he went in the water. So, but here's the point. He was circumcised as a baby. He went back under the care. He was taught and trained by his mother. He knew about the Hebrews. He knew about God. He knew about all those things to a point, however limited it may have been. Then he goes and he's raised in Pharaoh's house. At 40 years old, he goes out and what does he do? He kills an Egyptian man. He's rejected by the people, by the Hebrews the next day, and he flees and spends 40 years in Midian. That 40 years has passed. We're now in the third 40-year branch. By the way, Exodus 1 to Exodus 2 covers 80 years of his life. Exodus 3 till he dies is the last 40 years of his life. We get a whole lot more information about that time than we do the first 80 years. But we know that he was circumcised. At some point in that 40 years that he was in Midian, after he's married to Jethro's daughter, he has 2 sons who don't get circumcised, or at least one of them doesn't. Wonder why that is. Well, it's one of 2 things. He's either away from God, been away from God so long, he's not worried about it, or he's getting some kickback from his Midianite wife who doesn't want to do this to her sons. There's not a whole lot given to us about the particular circumstances here, but the fact that Zipporah is the one who actually circumcises the child indicates that the smiting of God, this wasn't like Ananias and Sapphira, where Moses just fell over. If God wanted him dead, he would have died instantaneously. This wasn't like the sons of Aaron who were immediately consumed by fire. Apparently he got sick and was nigh unto death. And apparently Zipporah realizes that it has something to do with circumcision. We're not told why she realizes that, whether there's communication along those lines, whether Moses brings it up. We're not told why, but she believes that if she circumcises her son, the problem is going to go away. So she circumcises him. She goes in, she touches the foreskin to Moses' feet. And then it says, so he let him alone. So at that obedient act, God relents and removes this sickness, this illness, whatever you want to call it, this pall of death. At the time that she said, you are a bridegroom of blood. Now, because of the circumcision. It's very specific, because of the circumcision. See, there's blood involved in circumcision. There's blood involved in this process. And this is more typology. And if you'll allow me to wait, I want to talk about this as an invitation tonight more fully. But I just want you to understand that at a base level, you find out, or we find out, that obedience to the covenant regulations of God are essential for everyone. And Moses is about to go and be God's covenant mouthpiece to his people. But his house isn't even following the covenant. And obedience was required. Without obedience came death. Now, I think with those general parameters, you can see how that fits in the new covenant. People debate whether or not obedience is necessary for salvation. Well, without obedience comes death. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a little while. Anybody have any questions or comments? It's a weird little thing. I'm going to go ahead and tell you the commentaries. It's really fun reading the commentaries on this because they struggle with it. It seems weird. It does not seem weird at all when you realize that everything we're being told has something to do with preparing us for the coming of the Messiah. That 80 years of his life that were covered in 2 chapters didn't have a whole lot to do with the coming of the Messiah. A couple of events did. Very important. By the way, do you also see the parallel in the record of Jesus' life and Moses' life? We get Moses when he's a baby, and we get Moses when he's a grown man. We get Jesus when he's a baby, and we get Jesus when he's a grown man. And there's all this silence in between those two things. That is not by accident. That is so that we can see and understand. I'll also suggest this real quick. In Luke chapter 16 and verse 10, there's another, just a little nugget that I think is exemplified here. He who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much. He who is unrighteous in a very little thing is unrighteous in much. If you want to make this circumcision a very little thing, if you don't pay attention to the very little things, you don't pay attention to the big things either. Is there anything that's unimportant? No. Is there anything of which I can say, well, that doesn't really matter. God doesn't really care about that. I know that's what it says, but he doesn't really care. No. And we pick up on that in this little incident. The Lord said to Aaron, go meet Moses in the wilderness. So he went and met him, at the mountain of God, and he kissed him. And Moses told Aaron all the words of the Lord which he had sent him, and all the signs that he had commanded him to do. And Moses and Aaron went and assembled all the elders of the sons of Israel, and Aaron spoke all the words which the Lord had spoken to Moses. He then performed the signs in the sight of the people, so the people believed. And when they heard that the Lord was concerned about the sons of Israel and that he had seen their affliction, then they bowed low and worshiped. And so it happens exactly the way God said. God said, you're going to go, you're going to do this, and the people are going to believe you. And that's what came to pass. All that fretting and worrying, completely empty and pointless. But you see how patient God is in dealing with him through all of it? And instead of just knocking him senseless, he goes, well, look, here's a sign. And look, you know what? Before you even ask, I'll give you a second sign, and I'll give you a third sign. So that you know that I'm aware. But here's what you really need to know, Moses. Folks who are trying to kill you, they're dead. And again, that line is used there to draw the parallel to the line that would be used of the Christ. So we can again see the parallel of these stories. And that's what's happening here. The story of Moses draws striking similarities to the story of Jesus. Just unbelievably striking similarities. That is not by accident. God will raise up one like unto Moses. Who'd that turn out to be? And the Christ turned out to be the man Jesus born in Nazareth. That's what we really have to understand and see in this. This is more work that God is doing. All of this work is to get the people of Israel out of Egyptian bondage, get them to a position, make a nation out of them, establish a kingdom out of them, that from that kingdom would come the Messiah. And while he's doing it in a particular way that mirrors what he is going to do with Christ himself, so that people recognize it when they see it. Wait a minute. The prophet said they would raise up one like unto Moses. And this Jesus fella, boy, there's a lot of similarities between him and Moses. Maybe this is the one that we've been looking for. That's exactly what's supposed to happen. And as we read the story, we're supposed to see it too. And again, I'll bring to your remembrance one more time, both in the book of Romans and in the first letter to Corinth, we're told these things were written for us, for our learning. Wasn't written for their learning. They were written after they lived through them. Written for our learning, upon whom the ends of the ages have come, so that we can see and appreciate all that God did to bring the Christ into the world. It was not an afterthought or a spur of the moment or an act of convenience. It was a planned and processed, carefully orchestrated thing. Not just to bring him into the world. God could have done that at any time, but to bring him in the world at the right time in order to accomplish the purpose. The purpose being what? Salvation, which can only happen not just from Jesus doing it, but what? People believing. All this stuff has to be done, and it has to be done in this way so that we might believe. And that believing, we can have life in his name. All right. Got to stop. Any questions or comments? As I mentioned earlier, I will, in the invitation tonight, talk just a little bit more about that section 24 through 26. Draw one more important conclusion. And then if the Lord wills, we'll pick up in chapter 5 next time. Yes, ma'am. Well, what I'll say is, she wasn't even a Hebrew. So, yep.
I have heard